From the Yale Center for Faith and Culture, this is For the Life of the World, a podcast about seeking and living a life worthy of our humanity.
I never felt so aware of my mortality. I was literally in the emergency room. I won't get into all the details of the day. I'm holding my 3-month-old baby who just got here. I'm like, my life just started. And I was like, I don't even know what this means. I don't even want to Google what it means. I'm scared. I'm scared for what it could be. Sorry, I did this before with Dan. I'm like, I think I'm good. And then I'm like, here it comes. Like, you can see it really affected me.
Kristen Tideman had just been diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. But not just that, she was a new mother and had been undergoing some religious change, adjusting her belief system. So all those years spent reading about mortality, finitude, and the weight of the human condition when she was studying philosophy, all of a sudden became real. Instead of just studying limits, she slammed right into one, or two, or three.
It was just so close to home. And I did a philosophy master's, not a PhD, which does have quite a bit of a different workload and a lot less reading. But you deal with the text, you get it, you're talking about it, you're with all your, philosophy friends. It's so rich. But then I think actually running into the wall of, oh, this is real. This is actually me. This is my life and it will end, is definitely a hard pill to swallow. And then recognizing all the ways, like we're even saying, anxiety and embracing mortality. There's ways I want to deny the MS. I want to deny that that's part of my existence now. I want to deny even components, I would say, of my own faith change instead of continuing to wrestle with them.
These denials, this natural human response of anxiety, running away, avoiding, denying that a diagnosis like this could happen, let alone when you're a new mother, denying the new identity it requires that you adopt, denying the significance of the way that faith shifting underneath you, whether you want it to or not, destabilizes. The rejection and the aversion, the impulse to look away. Maybe it's not always maladaptive. It's one of the most natural and universal things we might do. When we hit a wall we can't think our way past. The question becomes whether this anxiety shrinks your life or expands it.
I think the idea in existential psychology is everything is unfinished all the time. That doesn't mean that there's no progress. It doesn't mean that nothing gets done. Some discrete things are accomplished. But to be human is to be unfinished.
That's my friend Dan Koch, a therapist, a podcaster. He's making his way into a new modality of existential psychodynamic therapy, working with anxiety in a different kind of way.
Anxiety is a central concept in existential thought because the idea there is our brains are big enough and our minds are strong enough that unlike deer and plants and coconuts, we can think about the future. We can imagine our own death. And what the bomb does is it goes, not only can we now imagine our own death, we can actually imagine with pretty good specificity the death of every person at once. The death of the planet if it really went wrong.
Facing our own mortality, imagining your own death, imagining the death of the species, this deeply human capacity and the fear and anxiety of confronting it. What do we do with this? Do you leave it in the abstract reasoning of existential philosophy? Do you just slap a Band-Aid on it with some of the advice you can find all over social media? Kristen realized she had to answer that question in real time.
What is within my realm of control? How can I be responsible with that? How can I be faithful with that? And, there are days I wake up and I think I do that well, and days where I'm sure I kind of resort to the pathological. But again, these tools can help us in, I think, a very concrete way where a lot of things can be abstract. Social media advice can be abstract, but then this is something that's more grounded.
The difference between doing it well and doing it in some kind of pathological way, well, That's a pretty fast and steep drop. This line between the kind of anxiety that eats you alive and the anxiety that's trying to tell you something true, give you the gift of survival or even thriving. It's exactly along this sharp line where our conversation today lives.
Healthy anxiety broadens our world. It is a signal to us that we got to do something or stop doing something. And that can usually be combined with what we care about and the direction of our life. Anxiety of the unhelpful neurotic type spins us in our own mind. Our worlds get smaller. They become more insular, self-focused, self-referential. Is my world getting smaller or is my world getting bigger?
Dan Koch is a licensed therapist and the host of the podcast Religion on the Mind. Kristen Tideman is a founder of Tidy Studios, a marketing strategist and a creative consultant, living with a recent diagnosis of MS, and in this conversation, opening up quite a bit about the anxiety that has followed. Together, we discuss healthy versus unhealthy anxiety, their symptoms, and how to understand the difference, how existential philosophy treats anxiety and thrownness, or the brokenness, or the shipwreck of our life, mortality, motherhood, and multiple sclerosis, the post-World War II roots of existential therapy, the prospects of your world either shrinking or expanding, and a much deeper appreciation for what it means to be a work in progress, the hope that comes from being an unfinished human being. Thanks for listening today.
Kristen, Dan, thanks for joining me.
Hi.
Pleasure to be here, man.
A pleasure to talk about anxious times.
Nothing better, frankly. Evan, I'm an existential therapist, so
That's right.
This is my Q zone. Yep, love it.
What are you observing about our times that you would characterize as anxious, and in what way?
In the general sphere of, why tackle this, why now? I don't think it'll be a surprise to many people as there's a lot going on geopolitically speaking in terms of, you turn on the news and you're like, what? Like you're getting bombarded, you're getting kind of fire hosed news, which is not, we could say this is maybe not the first time it's happened, but of course, prior to, 20, 30 years ago, we didn't have it at this rate. And then there's the personal side of things. And I think that's where I was excited to tackle this project with Dan and kind of get into it, because I have a number of competing anxieties, if you will, or anxieties actually joining hands, coming together. I have a new daughter. I'm a new mother that's got its own anxieties. Yeah. I have a new fairly serious diagnosis that's the rest of my life, a chronic disease of multiple sclerosis, which I've had to navigate. And then I think, the ongoing faith change questions, which for me really started in grad school, kind of nicely coinciding with the beginning of COVID. But that is not something that just, as you know, neatly resolves. And there's ongoing questions and kind of it's, this one day and maybe that another. So in kind of trying to manage, not just manage, but really when we seek thriving, which I think we all talk about, how do you do that amidst all the anxieties that are in there?
I'll pick up at the religious change because that's kind of how I got into existential psychology. And the series is taking ideas from existential psychology and making them really practical. And I got into it more deeply because of therapy clients. I have therapy clients, and my sort of main specialty as a therapist is religious change. Usually that's either deconversion, leaving a fold, or deconstruction, reconstruction, major belief change, major practice change, generally not still comfortable at the same church from before that happened, that type of change. And there's often, family, there's downstream effects with family, marriage, parenting, all kinds of things. But really, you get into the more existential issues of who am I? What is morality? How am I going to sort of piece back together my orientation to the world? And so I felt like I got to dig deeper here in my own training to meet some of what I'm hearing as needs from my clients. And as I did it, I also just felt really personally a lot of resonance. And it didn't take long chatting with Kristen and just kind of a couple other therapist friends of, whoa, there are obviously personal applications here, but there's also this collective application. And turns out that existential psychology really comes out of post-World War II thought. It's that post-World War II flavor of existential philosophy. But also, people think of Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning. This is a very important text in the sort of modern development of existentialism toward therapeutic and psychological applications. And he's talking about finding meaning in the concentration camps. And it just doesn't get more anxious than World War II and post-World War II. And, give it 10 more years, it'll be the nuclear kind of Cold War fears. And, those were extremely anxious times. And so it's not a big jump to think maybe there's something from that time. And as it's been developed over the decades by careful psychologists and therapists and stuff, and it's been applied, it's become more practical. Well, we kind of find ourselves in a, not the same as those times in certain ways, but man, we recognize the flavor from the mid 20th century anxiety and our own.
I wonder if it really is the bomb. If like in the middle of the 20th century, the newly found capacity to destroy ourselves,
it's huge,
is like the anxiety bomb, literal in this case, that then creates a cascade of anxiety that just sort of is in a cycle now ever since. I don't know if I would characterize the modern period prior to the bomb as an anxious period. There might be other factors that lead it. Maybe there's growing anxiety, and we don't have to do a deep dive on the history of anxiety, but
depressing time, like as in the Great Depression.
Indeed.
I think the atomic bomb is a really good way of describing how existentialist thought, which is profoundly individualistic. It is literally about the human individual experience and trying to not say too much universally about the world and metaphysics and all that stuff. And let's really look at just what am I going through? What are you going through as one person and learning to understand that. And so it starts out as talking about anxiety. Anxiety is a central concept in existential thought, because the idea there is our brains are big enough and our minds are strong enough that unlike deer and plants and coconuts, we can think about the future. We can imagine our own death. And what the bomb does is it goes, not only can we now imagine our own death, we can actually imagine with pretty good specificity the death of every person at once, the death of the planet if it really went wrong. And so we talk in the series at both individual levels. That's religious change. That's Kristen's diagnosis. That's new motherhood. It's anxiety disorders, etc. We also talk collectively. And the bomb takes us to collective in one move. Like psychologically, it's just one move from individual to collective death. And so I think from an existential psychology perspective, it's super relevant and sort of ripe.
I want to introduce a little bit of clarity around what anxiety is. And it's too easy for this to be kind of conflated. Like the inner emotional space, I'm speaking personally often, is one of a little bit of confusion. Like what exactly is the emotion that's emerging, and how do I find the language to bring to it? And it's too tempting to over-explain it and then perhaps wrongly explain it. So,
okay. So you want to talk about anxiety versus something like depression, for instance?
Yeah, or fear. Like Kierkegaard distinguishes it from fear, for instance.
Well, I think the best way in is to actually talk about anxiety the way that existential psychologists talk about anxiety, distinguishing between healthy and unhealthy anxiety. And then from that, if we want to further distinguish between like depression or mania or OCD or something like that, we can also do that. But for them, some anxiety, because it is the natural result of our big old brains, some anxiety is good. if someone was running at you with a knife and you felt no foreboding about what was about to happen, well, you're going to die. Like you're not going to pass on your genes. That's not adaptive. It's literally maladaptive if you don't have certain types of healthy anxiety. If I am sitting there in the evening and I've got a full slate of clients tomorrow, and I look at my calendar and I was like, maybe I should stay up till 2 a.m. tonight partying with my buddy, then I should be feeling some healthy anxiety that if I do that, I'm going to be a bad therapist tomorrow and that'll have consequences. And so I will go, okay, I'm going to say no thank you to the invitation to go clubbing or what. I've never been clubbing, to go drink with a buddy. Let's not kid ourselves. So there's healthy anxiety, and the thumbnail version is healthy anxiety broadens our world. It is a signal to us that we got to do something or stop doing something. And that can usually be combined with what we care about and the direction of our life and whatnot. So on that Tuesday evening, I'm like, no, I'm not going to go get drunk. I care about being a good therapist. I have a full slate tomorrow. I got to get my ass to bed, right? I need to start my bedtime routine and get rest. Unhealthy anxiety becomes sort of self-referential, spiral-like. And it's like, oh, I look at my calendar and I go, 6 clients tomorrow. I'm going to do bad. Maybe I'm not a good therapist. Maybe they're going to be able to tell, following down that path, right? That's not spurring me towards anything. That's not going to contribute to getting good sleep. It's not about who I want to be. It's just like, it's becoming consuming. And so from a therapeutic perspective, when I've got a client who's feeling anxiety or coming in to talk about anxiety, one of the first things I want to figure out is which of this is the kind that we should be treating directly. Let's give you some more breathing room here. Let's give you some headroom. And which is the type that should be listened to because it's actually a message about a way that your life could be better than it currently is.
How does that capture you, Kristen?
I'm kind of thinking about how I'm sure you've run into clients, Dan, of those who probably over intellectualize even their maybe neurotic sort of anxiety and maybe even defend it. Like I could see dare I say myself being able to get to that place where I'm like, well, this is serving me. This is helping me. And I wonder how you help people kind of cross that bridge and, when it's more of a, justified belief, if you will.
Yeah, where I've seen that concretely most often is a belief that, say, someone has a very strong inner critic, and that's a term that people seem to pretty much understand what that means. A lot of internal criticism about how they might go wrong and where they might fail and whatever. And a lot of clients will come to genuinely believe that if they silence that incessant inner critic, that they will lose motivation. That is the thing that they basically, exactly what you're saying, they mistake unhealthy anxiety for healthy anxiety. Well, that's the reason I get things done. But the thing about it is that kind of criticism tends to lead to depression. And depression saps you of motivation. So unless there's some pretty good evidence, I'm gonna come in with the assumption that this is actually not helping you, and that what would be better is to bring down the stakes, bring down the overall distress. Let's clarify who you are and what you're about, and let's let your genuine values-centered goals, achievable goals that you can do, let's let that be the motivation. Because when you can identify that stuff and when you're not racked with depression or anxiety, people do tend to move toward that stuff. And it does provide its own source of energy without the sort of side effects of the self-hatred and the self-doubt and the sweaty palms and the heart rate increase and the discomfort in social situations, all that comes with the anxiety or depression. You can just get the good energy from the, from stuff that you want to be doing in the world.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny. Again, I bring this up partially because I can, I've seen myself in that you can hold on to your own anxiety as kind of this a crutch of a sort, and and it's just how you know how to operate. But as we went through, everything with the existential therapy, a lot of that values identification by kind of looking at what matters to us and then seeing, maybe something really great matters to us. Something we discussed is that everyone has maybe basic media literacy or something like that. That might be impossible. We can't control other people. But what do we see in the values that are in that? And it's more like, okay, well, we'd like to be able to talk with people that we care about and have a thoughtful conversation. We'd like to know that what we're, kind of hearing, we'd like to be able to kind of assess what's generally true and have a sense of a shared reality. Those things, again, not everything is within our control, but then what is? And how do we start to approach that? And that was, I think, for me, incredibly helpful. Again, with the different layers, you can assess the values in the different arenas. But I think that includes the faith as well.
Yeah. I kind of want to hang out on this point of trying to understand anxiety, because how you move from, big words, ontological anxiety to pathological anxiety being a pretty important distinction, as I understand it, for Kierkegaard and other existentialists, which is to say that there's some kind of given anxiety in the human condition where there's this discovery of our own freedom, right? Like it has to do with freedom, the price of freedom, you might say. Kierkegaard is concerned about that anxiety is the product of that once one faces the absolute, capital A, once one is an individual before God, there's nowhere to hide. You're kind of approaching, maybe this is jumping ahead, but we're like, maybe you're approaching a boundary situation. You're finding a boundary of your own existence and then asking what's beyond it. And you're also faced with certain questions of personal freedom and what your place is in the world. That is a sort of like commonality. And one thing that would be interesting to parse out is how neurotic anxiety, harmful anxiety, has been cultivated over the years as different from this sort of basic ontological anxiety that might face just anybody.
So going back to our big brains, the mind is incredibly powerful. It shapes our individual realities in ways that most of us are usually unaware of. But, with things being pointed out, with a good therapeutic relationship, like we can kind of come to see that stuff better, or even just, smart people reading, doing a workbook or whatever by themselves. You're talking about personal freedom, the fact that I have free choices, they matter in the world, they are capable of genuinely harming people, for instance. This is, for existential thinkers, this is one of the existential givens, one of these tough, heavy burdens, especially initially, that nonetheless are just true of a human life. And where I think it sort of hinges from a psychological perspective, I can't speak to the philosophy as well. It hinges on avoidance or engagement and acceptance. That's the dichotomy. So if I am avoiding those realities, if I am doing whatever I can to deny moment by moment my understanding that I will die, my understanding that I am fundamentally just my own person, no one can kind of make me good. If I am denying the responsibility I hold as a person with free moral choices, these kinds of things, then that's going to move me towards unhealthy anxiety. Mm-hmm. Basically, it's like I have a giant sore on my forearm, and I'm just gotten really good with concealer and Band-Aids, and I wear long sleeve shirts. But eventually it's going to get gangrenous, and it's like what I really need to do is treat the sore, and I need to accept and engage with those heavy realities of being a human being with a big old brain. And if I do that, then it has this paradoxical way of it's such a scary thing to consider dealing with this big sore that is causing me so much pain. And every time I touch anywhere near it or think about it, I get worried and it hurts. And so there is this sort of hurdle to jump over, a sort of it gets worse before it gets better kind of a thing, which anybody who's done trauma work will recognize. But then on the other end of it, you're able to go, oh, okay. There's really a Plato's cave kind of element of this, of you kind of get up out and you see things more clearly. And those things, some of those things are hard, but there is Kristen said flourishing earlier. I think that's a pretty good word for what I'm searching for, of like a really flourishing human life will never be a person who ignores the fact that they will die someday, that they have real responsibility. That's not a flourishing person. It's sort of a prerequisite for a certain kind of maturity and flourishing. And it also tends to have a positive effect on things like neurotic or unhealthy anxiety. I'm not sure. I'm not totally answering the Kierkegaard part, maybe, but I mean, that's my psychological angle.
That's we're going to just be kind of like exploring around it and kind of just be wondering. Kristen, I was curious about how you'd answered that question, like the move from ontological anxiety, which is sort of basic to the human condition per se, the species level, and then given how you're conceiving of anxiety, how does that land? How does it move into the threat of a harmful anxiety that is pathological? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I could easily refer to my own pathological anxiety. I'm not like singling you out.
Well, I mean, something, Dan, that, you mentioned we could get into later, and maybe we will, is that component of like kind of OCD, and it doesn't maybe necessarily have to be the official diagnosis to recognize that anxiety does have there's a control component at times. And I would say definitely in my life. I'm not saying for everyone. It's funny, even in some of my kind of exposure to cognitive science of religion, is like there can be even a component where you're like, if I am anxious, it's almost like that's staving off the negative outcomes. Like it's almost, you're kind of superstitious, which is, again, I think there's this is all the pathological side of things. But on the ontological side, there's being cognizant of it, and then there's kind of feeling it and accepting it, really embracing that as reality, which is, I don't know if I had ever even had the full chance to do until my diagnosis, where I told Dan this, I never felt so aware of my mortality because there was so many questions. I was literally in the emergency room. I won't get into all the details of the day. I'm holding my 3-month-old baby who just got here. I'm like, my life just started. And I was like, I don't even know what this means. I don't even want to Google what it means. I'm scared. I'm scared for what it could be. Sorry. I did this before with Dan. I'm like, I think I'm good. And then I'm like, here it comes. Like you can see it really affected me.
It is.
It was just so close to home and saying, all this time, because I did a philosophy master's, not a PhD, which does have quite a bit of a different workload and a lot less reading. But you deal with the text, you get it, you're talking about it, you're with all your, philosophy friends. It's so rich. But then I think actually running into the wall of, oh, this is real. This is actually me. This is my life and it will end, is definitely a hard pill to swallow. But then I think, again, having to embrace that. That's what this process is. And then recognizing all the ways, like we're even saying, anxiety and embracing mortality. There's ways I want to deny the MS. I want to deny that that's part of my existence now. I want to deny even components, I would say, of my own faith change. And instead of continuing to wrestle with them. And I have sympathy for people who, a lot of people are tired. That's what's a little, tricky in some of this, is there's a lot of exhaustion. Even if we just talk about, the media side of things, kind of ingesting all of that can be just so tiring. And it's maybe more than we were designed to handle. But at the same time, having a certain recognition of there are tough things going on. Let's not deny that. And then, yes, what is within my realm of control? How can I be responsible with that? How can I be faithful with that? And, there are days I wake up and I think I do that well, and days where I'm sure I kind of resort to the pathological. And I think that's, but again, these tools can help us. And, and I think a very concrete way where a lot of things can be abstract, social media advice can be abstract, but then this is something that's more grounded.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I hear the reality of it in your voice and your story. And I think it gives voice to like the particularity of your situation, which I'm really sorry about. And in the acknowledgement of how that multiplies in different ways and to different extents with any individual. And I think it does lay down the individual nature of it. And that's why, here's one just like fairly important, if not obvious, distinction here between the ontological anxiety and then moving into what feels like anxious times right now, post-atomic bomb. And then in the wake of any atomic bombs in our own individual lives is individuality. And it's the individual staring into the abyss and wondering what's there. And it feels dizzying. I'm borrowing from Kierkegaard there, that it's like he calls anxiety the dizziness of freedom. Mm-hmm. And the dizziness of maybe our precarity, like our finitude.
Well, dizziness is great too, because it's a bodily metaphor.
Yeah.
And one thing that I was sort of thinking about your question and Kristen's answer both is that acceptance, so accepting these limits, limits on the length of our life, the limits of our agency, what we can and can't control. That happens cognitively, but it also happens bodily. So coming up against an MS diagnosis, I don't mean the MS itself. I mean the acceptance of that fact. That's got to be cognitive. There is a thought-related element of that. Kristen has come to sort of be able to think about it and talk about it and accommodate that knowledge. But it is also bodily, affective, somatic. One thing I like to say with clients about processing and feeling our emotions is that I was thinking about it one day and I was like, it's kind of like a built-up charge in like a power plant that needs to get worked out through the wires. It needs a place to go. Otherwise it's going to make the transformer spark and blow up.
Oh yeah.
And then I was like, emotions aren't like electricity that needs to go through electrical system. They literally are in part electricity that needs to get through an electrical system. Our nervous system is electric. And so that metaphor is pretty good, right? And so
it's more literal,
also it's pretty literal. It's barely even a metaphor. And so for Kristen and for anyone else in a similar situation, which could be both sort of like concrete, like new motherhood or the diagnosis, or more general, like recognizing these limits of our own individual lives, like that does have to happen cognitively. It also has to happen in your body. And if it doesn't, then there will be downstream consequences of that if you don't find a way to feel and sit with and process the emotional side of it.
Yeah. Yeah. On the acceptance point, and I'm not sure if I'm getting this right or representing him well, but Jaspers.
Let's talk about Carl.
He's also using a metaphor of a shipwreck and acceptance of a shipwreck, and yet accepting it without nihilism. And I think what I understand that to be is that the sense in which there's this sort of crisis moment of a human being coming up against the boundary of themselves, coming up against a wall, where our ordinary coping structure just does not work. Our defenses, our healthy defenses that enable us to continue flourishing might break down. And that is a shipwreck. And yet, can we live in this shipwreck? Can we live in this sort of brokenness without resorting to nihilism?
Kristen, you or me?
You, please.
Yeah. So Jaspers talks about a shipwreck. Sartre has his version. Man is like a blind person on a raft. Kierkegaard has his version. Humans are like a ship captain in the middle of a storm.
Women are fine, actually.
Women don't exist in these metaphors. But so these metaphors, what they share is this idea, to use a term from Sartre, of thrownness. We are thrown into the world. And what's interesting is there can be a little conflict here between, let's just say, like a standard Christian view or the way it typically gets taught to children. You knit me together in my mother's womb. The count of every hair on my head. There is a sense in Christianity, as I received it, that no, I am born here in this family. I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. I'm in the image of God. And I remember thinking like, oh, how lucky I am that I was born into a Christian family, right? And these kinds of thoughts will sometimes hit you as you're growing up. And there can be a sense in which like, no, God specifically chose all the details of your birth. Not every Christian believes that, but that's a kind of a common way of thinking of it. And existentialism would say it may be that in some sense, God is certainly God. If God exists, God's okay with whatever we were born with and happen to be born into. But our lived experience of being a human is one of being kind of tossed haphazardly into a particular genetics. I didn't choose my genetics. I didn't choose what year or what continent I would be born on. I didn't choose my parents' previous life experiences that shaped the way that they raised me. So I had panic disorder for 15 years, came by it honestly and genetically through my grandpa and my mom. Didn't choose that. So much of what we deal with is not chosen. I didn't choose for AOL broadband to become readily available when I was hitting puberty. But that's what happened, right? So, like all these things, you think about like we've been talking on the show about on the podcast about. Let's say you're 25, first kid, starting your business, but you're in Ukraine and then Russia attacks you. Like you didn't choose that. You're thrown into that situation, and so. If it's true that everyone is similarly thrown with whatever the particular details are there, but if the thrownness is consistent, what Jaspers is saying is you can fight that and you can pretend it's not true, but your life is going to get better if you accept it. And if you go, okay, what pieces are left from my shipwreck? Oh, I've still got a few planks over there. One of the cannons is still working, whatever, fill it out, the metaphor, take it as far as you want. But we all have those limitations. And a lot of them are identical in basic form, if not identical in detail.
Well, sorry to be picky here, Dan, but credit to where credit is due. I think this is a bit of a Heidegger concept. Maybe
is
start expanded.
I was thinking when I said start, I was like, wait, no, is that one Heidegger? Okay, yeah.
This is I'm
the psychology guy, okay?
No, it's okay. That's why we don't blame you. And also Heidegger, his reputation as a little... I
try and give Heidegger as little credit as possible. Just the whole unrepentant Nazi thing. That's really the main... That's the main problem I have with him. But, your mileage may vary on that.
Well, and that could open up a whole other can of worms. But yeah, he's the
thrownness guy. You're right.
He's the thrownness guy on his tombstone. It's me.
Let's go toward then the flight from that. These are boundary situations that we're talking about, which I understand them to be at least these: death, guilt, struggle, and chance.
So just briefly, those are like the givens. That's what we would say. Those are like the realities. Boundary situations, which Jaspers talks about, are moments in time. He starts at an individual level when you recognize those givens because something has changed in your life. Kristen receiving an MS diagnosis is an example of a boundary situation. It's like, okay, I had one plan and I had one set of tools and now I have to modify that. I can't do business as usual anymore. And we've been applying it also collectively. So I think that Kristen has sort of gestured at these already earlier, but the way that our sociopolitical situation is feeling very chaotic, the way that related to that, there is apparently a pretty profound lack of shared reality between people on opposite sides of some of those issues. I think the precipitous rise of AI is a boundary situation. It asks us, what is intelligence? What's humanity? Are there whole swaths of the economy that are going to basically go away and be automated? What do I bring to the world? So these are boundary situations, and what boundary situations do is highlight the reality of those difficult existential givens like death, freedom, isolation.
What would it be then to genuinely confront this? Let's hone in on acceptance.
If anybody knows, tell me. No, I'm kidding.
Yeah, no.
Okay. Well, Kristen, like what? I'm curious. You could speak from lived experience. I know you're very much still in the middle of some of this, but where do you see evidence? Like, how do you know that you've grown in acceptance of some of these realities? Like, what would you point to? What do you point to internally?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I would say a big theme in what we discussed, it's already even come up today, is a little bit of this maturity component. And that seems to be thematic when I assess anything along the lines of anxiety and in any of these realms where, again, I think especially the neurotic, pathological anxiety has almost an attitude of, like, it's almost an expression and it's a tenseness. You can, you feel it, like my shoulders, whenever they go up in my real life when I'm in anxious situations. I've been told that. Someone in college was like, put your shoulders down. I was like, okay, you're not helping. But I would say that it's not, there are days where I recognize I was not totally, like, it wasn't totally linear. It wasn't like, there are days where I'm like, oh, I think I succumbed to the pressure of that. And then there are days where I'm like, it's an opportunity. It's an opportunity to say, kind of this is the life I've been given. There's actually, it's coming to mind as a Frederick Buechner quote. This is your life. Terrible and beautiful things will happen. Don't be afraid. And it's kind of, and I think on my better days, that's the attitude I'm taking. And it came up recently. I was like looking for something in my archives, and I used to have it actually as a daily reminder, which is so funny because I was like, oh, this is more appropriate than ever. And one of the quotes is the well-known Kierkegaard quote of, like, marry and you will regret it. Don't marry and you will regret it. Whether you marry or don't marry, you'll regret it. It was like, weep for the world's foolishness, laugh at the world's foolishness, all these, those sorts of things. So that there are different quotes on there, but the one that has really stood out is basically anything that comes at us, we can use as an excuse to weaken our resolve or to strengthen it. And I feel very appropriately challenged by that. I think that there are days where I want to be like, oh, poor me, really, I think, and that's a very human impulse too. I'm not trying to shame people, but in the end, it's like what you said, Dan, of does that help in the long run? Does that lead towards flourishing? Does it lead towards proper maybe integration of reality? And I don't think so. And then, the last thing I'll say, Dan knows I always have these kind of tendrils, quotes, connected moments, life. Yeah, when I studied abroad in Costa Rica, there was someone I met and he had this phrase in Spanish. It was like, pobrecito nadie, which is basically like poor little person, kind of like poor guy, no one, so no one's like a poor, and it was kind of like, you could go too hardcore and not say poor me or whatever. But it's like, you can also see that in a positive light and say, no, I could say, pobrecito, or I could say, no, let me just take this day. I don't need to focus on why it could be bad, or I could see the misfortunes in it, and I can embrace it and again, integrate it. So hopefully that's my intent, as I alluded to, not always successful every day, but
I think where I would want to end is how to move forward with no resolution, where there's no solution necessarily, but it's just unresolved uncertainty, disagreement, unresolved issues that are just going to become moment to moment. I'll let you land the plane.
I mean, I think that's the whole game. I think the idea in existential psychology is everything is unfinished all the time. And that doesn't mean that there's no progress. It doesn't mean that nothing gets done. So in a sense, like, some discrete things are accomplished, but to be human is to be unfinished. It is to have constantly limits around you. And your choice, among other things, is to accept them or pretend they're not there. Kristen mentioned the sort of bodily signs of anxiety being reframed and getting healthier, right? I think we can connect that back to the unhealthy versus healthy anxiety thing here as well. And one way that we talk about that is my world getting smaller or is my world getting bigger? And one way that I think is a cool thing we haven't added on yet is all of us together have these limits. We have these real limitations, but we're all in the same boat, raft, shipwreck. Pick your nautical metaphor. We're all in the same boat. And so one way that, like Emmy van Derzen, the sort of a British popularizer of existential therapy, along with Irvin Yalom in the States, sort of contemporaries, she says one way that your world gets bigger in accepting those limits is that the real problems of the world tend to require collaboration. They are bigger than one person can solve. And I think this connects back to human flourishing, that we evolved, we are designed to work in groups. We are social animals. We are family and community oriented. And so anxiety of the unhelpful neurotic type spins us in our own mind. Our worlds get smaller. They become more insular, self-focused, self-referential. And when we go, oh, okay, here's the limit. Now what do I want to do? It often forces us to go, well, who can help? And now we're relating. And maybe we're even loving our neighbor. And they're loving us. And if we're Christians, we can also say, now God is loving us through that person. And we are loving God through loving that person. And so that's maybe how I would put a little gloss or an end cap on Kristen's wonderful answer.
Well, I want to thank each of you, Kristen, you in particular, for both the courage and the clarity of sharing where you're at the moment and allowing any listener, including myself, to feel less alone about the anxieties that crop up in our own individual lives. Thank you both.
Thank you, Evan.
Thank you, Evan.
I look forward to the next time.
For the Life of the World is a production of the Yale Center for Faith and Culture at Yale Divinity School. This episode featured Kristen Tideman and Dan Koch. Production assistance by Noah Sentil. I'm Evan Rosa, and I edit and produce the show. For more information, visit us online at faith.yale.edu and lifeworthliving.yale.edu. You'll find all sorts of educational resources to help people envision and pursue lives worthy of our humanity. If you're a new listener, remember to hit subscribe in your favorite podcast app so you don't miss our next episode. And if you've been listening for a while, consider sharing this episode. Or if not sharing, give us a rating and review in Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Your support means a lot to us. Either way, we're grateful that you're listening, friends, and we'll be back with more soon.